the king of pop art, the host of the world-famous studio, The Factory, a man who placed the biggest stars in the world on the same level as a can of soup, a man nicknamed Eggplant Nose, a painter who called himself asexual, someone who claimed that one day everyone would be famous for 15 minutes, and turned out to be absolutely right, someone who faced death and came back after nearly an hour. Let's get to know him and the luxury woven into his art a little more closely. Andy Warhol was born on August 6, 1928, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to a family of Czechoslovak immigrants. From childhood, he struggled with a number of health issues and had his share of insecurities about his physical appearance. He was a boy with nearly albino white skin covering most of his body, a large nose that would flush red whenever he was embarrassed. Naturally, he was bullied by his peers his entire life. Because of this, he became a shy, introverted child. That's where the nickname Eggplant Nose came from. The wounds left by school bullying affected him so deeply that in later years, photographs were found in which he had drawn over his ID photos, slimming the sides of his nose with pen strokes, retouching his eyebrows and eyes, because he found his nose too large. Despite surrounding himself his entire life with people obsessed with aesthetics, despite despising his own appearance because of it, and despite his well-known love of plastic and artifice, he never once went under the knife. I believe it was partly out of fear of surgery, but perhaps he also wanted to prove something. That even with all the bullying, even looking exactly the way he did, he could still become one of the most famous artists in the world. After graduating from the Carnegie Institute of Technology in Pittsburgh, he entered the art world in New York as a commercial illustrator. At the start of his professional career, he set out making illustrations for magazines. His first major commission came from the editor of Harper's Bazaar, an order for 100 illustrations. Of course, like every artist, his road was paved with thorns. There is actually a letter from that period that gives us a glimpse into his financial situation at the time. Russell Lines, photographer and assistant editor at Harper's Bazaar, asked Warhol for a biography to publish in the magazine. Andy Warhol wrote a lovely one and attached to it the following note. "Dear Lines, thank you so much. My life can't even fill a $1 postcard. I was born in Pittsburgh in 1928, in parentheses, like everyone else from there. I didn't come out of a steel mill. I graduated from a tech school. Now I wander from one cockroach-infested apartment to another here in New York." That tells us quite enough about his financial situation at the time. Once he began producing illustrations, driven by the extraordinary excitement of finally entering the profession he had dreamed of for years, he created such vivid and beautiful work that he was quickly noticed. He went on to illustrate for some of the most prestigious fashion and art magazines, and in time, he began designing iconic covers as well. Now, how did Andy Warhol go from drawing illustrations and magazine covers to this entirely different artistic universe? How did he step into fine art? How did he decide to market himself as an artist? After World War II, America, which had played one of the most decisive roles alongside Britain and Russia, emerged from the war as a superpower, having come out of it in a state of extraordinary material strength. So much so that America, already built on a foundation of consumerism, began producing 1 out of every 2 products made in the entire world. At the same time, people of that era understood that salvation lay in science, art, and technology. So on one hand, they wanted to stoke the fires of capitalism. On the other, they wanted to position the country as a global powerhouse in these fields. America, in other words, was beginning to work on version 2.0 of itself. Consumer frenzy was taking hold. Purchasing power was rising. Production was already booming in America. But to sell all of it, what did you need? Marketing, advertising. Andy Warhol, like all truly sharp artists, was someone who could read and analyze the era he lived in with extraordinary clarity. He was fully aware that America was a society built on consumption, and he understood that his own work needed to move in that direction. He was searching for a place to position his art, and the moment he found it, he knew he had hit the bullseye. According to Warhol, any ordinary object from everyday life could become the subject of his art. His background in graphic design meant he could produce work at a much faster, more serial pace, and he understood that this would bring him serious money. And being someone who truly loved money, passionately, unashamedly, he channeled his art entirely in that direction. This, naturally, drew him toward techniques that allowed for mass production. Silkscreen printing, for instance. And this brings us to the right moment to talk about one of his most famous silkscreen works, widely regarded as the Mona Lisa of the 20th century, the Marilyn Monroe portrait. In 1962, Marilyn Monroe passed away. Warhol, who harbored a deep admiration for everything that was famous and iconic, was deeply moved by her death. In her memory, he created a stunning silkscreen portrait. The painting received enormous acclaim and became the most expensive painting ever sold in the 20th century, setting a record that has been nearly impossible to break. It sold for exactly $195 million. Warhol's motivation was this: anything can be the subject of art. And whether it's a bottle of Coca-Cola, a can of tomato soup, or Marilyn Monroe, regardless of category, everything can be consumed. In the Monroe portrait, the contours, lines, and colors are initially sharp and vivid. But slowly, the lines begin to tremble, the colors begin to lose their power. As if the silkscreen frame itself were gradually breaking down, everything slowly fades and collapses into black and white. You can see the same in his Coca-Cola bottles. In other words, his core purpose was to make us question the frenzy of consumerism, to hold a mirror up to our own reflexes as consumers. After the Marilyn Monroe portrait, Warhol's fame in the art world reached a whole new level. Now, we've talked about Andy Warhol, and we've talked about Marilyn Monroe. Let's talk about the Campbell soup cans. The same logic applied. Mass production, repetition. Andy kept producing them over and over. There are also his extraordinary handcrafted works created for the Velvet Underground. These, we could say, are among Andy Warhol's most signature pieces. On another note, Warhol himself drew inspiration from the world's most famous psychoanalyst, Freud. How so? Freud once said, "No matter how dramatic a photograph is, even if it reaches the level of pornography in its drama, if you keep looking at it long enough, it loses its meaning." With that in mind, when an ambulance accident occurred in America at the time, the photographs were plastered across newspapers and everywhere else. Warhol took one of these images, deeply traumatic for America at the time, a photograph of an ambulance crash with human bodies being pulled from the wreckage, a horrifying and disturbing image. And just like his other works, he multiplied it, reproduced it again and again, until it surrendered its meaning. Drawing on this inspiration from Freud, he achieved something truly rare. He turned to his friend Gerard and said, "We need a proper studio now." The two of them then spent a full month and a half wandering the streets of New York together. When Andy Warhol was searching for a studio, he was thinking about doing everything he had ever imagined for his art inside it. He wanted to shoot films there, paint there. It had to be a place with large open spaces and high ceilings. And the place they eventually found was an abandoned lot left over from an old hat factory. The moment Andy walked in, he fell in love with it. He felt he could feed and grow his creativity here. This place was now the factory, and that is how the factory was born. The factory opened at a remarkable pace, and almost immediately, films were being shot inside, paintings were being made. There was extraordinary creative output. But at the same time, this place, open 24 hours a day, was never short of parties either. Andy also had artist guests, wonderful people from the art world who would come and visit. They would create together, talk about art, and share ideas with one another. Unfortunately, not all visitors fit the profile Warhol had in mind. His ideal guests were people like Jean-Michel Basquiat, a true companion who produced extraordinary work alongside him. But as fate would have it, nearly every alcoholic in New York at the time ended up pouring into the factory looking for a party. In a way, this actually suited Andy's purposes, because he began using these figures, some of them on the very edge of losing themselves to alcohol, as subjects for his art. He shot their videos, photographed them, and used them as models for the unconventional films he was making. Among the visitors who appeared in his films, there are two people I want to talk about. One is Jean-Michel Basquiat. The other is a woman named Valerie Solanas, a radical feminist. Though calling her a feminist would be doing feminism a disservice. Because while feminism advocates for equal rights between men and women, This woman believed the male gender needed to be completely eradicated. She was also, for the record, the author of a manifesto called the SCUM Manifesto, the Society for Cutting Up Men. Now, when Valerie Solanas showed up at Andy Warhol's studio, she entered under the guise of wanting to create, just like the others. She brought Andy a script she had written and presented it to him. I believe she did this deliberately, knowing full well he wouldn't be interested, but you'll understand why as this unfolds. One day, Valerie cornered him inside the factory and asked, "Andy, did you read the script I wrote?" Andy told her he hadn't read it. "Then give it back," Valerie said. But the script was nowhere to be found. At this point, I believe she was the one who had taken it herself. So, the script hadn't been read, and the script had vanished. Furious beyond measure, on her next visit, Valerie Solanas pulled a gun she had hidden in the pocket of her coat and fired a single shot into Andy Warhol's heart. Being as famous and visible as he was, news that Andy Warhol had been shot and had died spread instantly. He remained dead for approximately half an hour. Then his doctor, with nothing left to lose, made one final desperate move. He cut open his chest entirely, held his heart with his bare hands, and massaged it back to life. Andy Warhol returned to the world after taking a tour through the land of the dead. The factory, whose scandals, parties, and revolving door of visitors had seemed endless, was forced to close its doors after this incident. But here's the thing. When we say Andy Warhol, don't make the mistake of thinking he was simply someone who made colorful, lively, beautifully graphic, and consumable art. He was someone who deeply understood the role of art as a force that makes people question, and he worked tirelessly and successfully to transmit that to his audience. Those are Andy Warhol's most signature works. I also feel I should touch on his filmmaking career. Let me just name a few: The Kiss, Blow Job, Eat, and many more, each as intriguing as the last. Later, he began making much longer films. He shot one called Sleep, a film of his lover sleeping for exactly 6 hours. Then there's Empire. He locked a camera onto the Empire State Building and filmed it for a straight 8 hours. There's another film I think captures Andy and his art beautifully, one I genuinely loved watching. It's called Eating. The original film was around 4 minutes long, and in a move that was, quite fittingly, entirely in the spirit of Andy Warhol, Burger King took that film, cut it down to 45 seconds, and turned it into a commercial called Like Andy. I think there are 3 films and 1 documentary you should watch about Andy Warhol. Feel free to take notes. The first is I Shot Andy Warhol, a film about Solanas' attempt on his life and Andy's return from the dead. The second is The Factory Girl, starring Sienna Miller in the lead role, a great film for getting to know the factory. And third, The Andy Warhol Diaries, which you can find on Netflix. It's a beautifully made documentary miniseries. Tragically, and through a cruel twist of fate, Andy Warhol entered surgery for a pancreatic condition on February 22, 1987, and never came out. He lost his life on the operating table. In 1994, in the city where he was born, Pittsburgh, in the northern United States, the largest museum ever dedicated to a single artist was opened, the Andy Warhol Museum. We've never really talked about Andy Warhol's mother, Julia Warhola. Despite having no formal education, she was an incredibly talented woman. She would bring Andy coloring books, and they would sit together looking through comic magazines. When her son moved to New York, she came with him. She had a remarkably striking handwriting, and some of those elegant, curving signatures we see in Andy's early illustrations were actually written in Julia's hand. The fact that he wove his mother's handwriting into his own signature was a genuinely beautiful thing. When you picture Warhol, that silver-white, voluminous hair you see in your mind was, in fact, entirely a wig. And the number of these wigs grew over time, because sadly, Andy had begun losing his hair at a young age. Rather than hiding it, he transformed the wig into a character, into a brand. I find it incredibly inspiring, the way he took one of his vulnerabilities and turned it into a trademark. We can only call that a reflection of his brilliance. We can't move on without talking about Andy Warhol's magazine, Interview. Founded by the artist in 1969, it published exclusively interviews with famous names. Many people don't know this today, but Interview magazine played an enormous role in shaping pop culture into the celebrity-driven, tabloid-tinged phenomenon it has become. Warhol made celebrities interview other celebrities. In other words, it wasn't an ordinary journalist asking the questions, it was another star. For its time, that format was nothing short of revolutionary. Warhol knew how to make money, and he was never shy about it. Making money is art, working is art, and good business is the best art, he would say openly, without a moment's hesitation. Naturally, many critics used this against him. He sold out, they said, but Andy simply shrugged and moved on. Because in his view, in order to critique a consumer society through that very society's own lens, you had to use its own weapons against it. Then there was Warhol's project known as the time capsules. Hundreds of cardboard boxes. Whatever landed on his desk throughout his life. Unopened letters, newspaper clippings, photographs, invitations, even leftover food. He simply put it all in a box. It might sound like the habit of a hoarder, but today those boxes are still being examined one by one at the museum in Pittsburgh. He had transformed the most ordinary remnants of everyday life into an artistic archive. Perhaps that was his greatest work of all, every single day he ever lived.